The Constitution, in defining the powers and responsibilities of the President, says that he shall from time to time give the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. In Washington, early in January 1967, members of the 90th Congress began assembling. In a few days, they would formally convene. One of the first items on their agenda would be the President's annual address. Putting the State of the Union address in its final form is one of the most exacting and exhausting tasks a president faces. For Lyndon Johnson, it would occupy much of his working day throughout December and early January. The address capsulizes the administration's legislative aims and is, to many, the barometer of the time. It is normally delivered when Congress convenes and is followed shortly by the federal budget message, which in turn is followed by the economic report. All three are so tightly interwoven that decisions affecting one report have direct impact upon the others.
We're trying to decide how much money we will spend next year in the military and civilian field. We're trying to study developments in the economy. We're trying to determine the extent of our deficit. We're trying to anticipate as far ahead as we can economic indicators.
One of the big questions that would have to be resolved before the State of the Union address was the advisability of the tax increase.
We are working very hard on it, but we haven't made a decision. We'll bring all these people together, the Treasury and the economic advisors, the Secretary of Labor and Secretary of Commerce, the congressional leadership, and then attempt to make the recommendation that we think is justified.
At the same time he prepared the '68 budget, he wielded the power built into the '67 budget to moderate the inflationary pressures that had recently been felt in the nation's economy. He sought cutbacks in federal programs totaling over $5 billion.
I feel that we ought to take all the water that we can out of the budget, and I've spent several weeks trying to do that. But I'm not one that feels that, as I said last January, and as I'll say again next January, that we must neglect the health and the education of our children, that we can overlook the needs of our cities, that we must bring progress to a stop.
There was little or no hard news from the White House during these appointment-packed days. But the President did emerge from the Cabinet room and from the budget discussions to preside over some rewarding moments of office. On the 5th of January, he launched the new March of Dimes campaign. In so doing, he received unexpected help from some of the more exuberant members of the White House family. On the same day, the President greeted 10 high school students, chosen to represent America in a summer science program to be hosted by Australia.
In the next few weeks, through the generosity of the University of Sydney and the Australian people, you will go there to meet these students from other lands, and you will be guests in their homes, and you will share their experiences. And the journey that you will begin tomorrow will strengthen, I think, the friendship between our countries. You may feel that it's an honor to receive these medals that mark your achievement today. But I want you to know that we feel honored in your presence. And like your own parents, I feel a bit uncomfortable when I reflect that you can do the new math when I remember how much difficulty I had with the old math.
If math was a problem to the younger Lyndon Johnson, it was not in evidence in the early part of January 1967. He continually submerged himself in the 12-digit figures of the upcoming fiscal program. He shaped and tailored the proposals to meet the needs of the nation's ever-expanding economy and the ever-increasing requirements of the nation's commitment in Vietnam. The federal budget is a massive instrument. When it is coupled with an imaginative and flexible fiscal policy, the budget provides the very foundation upon which all federal plans and commitments can be achieved. As the day of the address approached, the pace at the White House quickened. Staffers worked long hours roughing out the drafts for the President's review. By 10 January, the day that the address was scheduled, the President was in virtual isolation. He had been up most of the night continuing to review and analyze various proposals. He blue-penciled some and pressed forward with the seemingly endless additions and subtractions. According to insiders, he had not yet made the decision on the tax increase. But he had mastered the new math. And whichever way he decided, no one could doubt that he had done his homework, and that if his decision called for some sacrifice, it would be in the nation's best interest.
I've come here tonight to report to you that this is a time of testing for our nation. At home, the question is whether we will continue working for better opportunities for all Americans when most Americans are already living better than any people in history. Abroad, the question is whether we have the staying power to fight a very costly war when the objective is limited and the danger to us is seemingly remote. So our test is not whether we shrink from our country's cause when the dangers to us are obvious and close at hand, but rather whether we carry on when they seem obscure and distant. And some think that it is safe to lay down our burdens. I have come tonight to ask this Congress and this nation to resolve that issue, to meet our commitments at home and abroad, to continue to build a better America, and to reaffirm this nation's allegiance to freedom.
He spoke of the progress the country had recently made in creating a better life for its people. But there was still a lot of hard, frustrating work ahead.
But I have come here tonight to discuss with you 5 ways of carrying forward the progress of these last 3 years. And these 5 ways concern programs and partnership and priorities and prosperity and peace. First, programs. We must see to it, I think, that these new programs that we have passed work effectively and are administered in the best possible way. 3 years ago, we set out to create these new instruments of social progress. This required trial and error, and it has produced both. But as we learn through success and failure, we are changing our strategy and we are trying to improve our tactics. In the long run, these starts, some rewarding, others inadequate and disappointing, are crucial to success.
He called for a strengthening of the administration of his programs, combining and consolidating when necessary for efficiency, reorganizing and reshaping, but always seeking improvement.
Where there have been mistakes, we will try very hard to correct them. Where there has been progress, we will try to build upon it. Our second objective is partnership, to create an effective partnership at all levels of government. And I should treasure nothing more than to have that partnership begin between the executive and the Congress. The 88th and the 89th Congress passed more social and economic legislation than any single two Congresses in American history. Most of you who were members of those Congresses voted to pass most of those measures. But your efforts will come to nothing unless it reaches the people.
The President then launched into his third objective, priorities. Each would be followed up in detail in future messages to Congress. He would help the aged, the migratory farm worker, those living in rural poverty. He would transform decaying slums into places of decency.
We should vastly expand the fight for clean air with a total attack on pollution at its sources. And because air, like water, does not respect man-made boundaries, we shall set up regional airsheds throughout this great land. We should continue to carry every corner of the nation our campaign for a beautiful America, to clean up our towns, to make them more beautiful, our cities, our countryside, by creating more parks and more seashores and more open spaces for our children to play in and for the generations that come after us to enjoy.
The fourth objective was prosperity. On this point, the long-awaited answer to the tax increase question was finally pronounced.
I recommend to the Congress a surcharge of 6% on both corporate and individual income taxes to last for 2 years, or for so long as the unusual expenditures associated with our efforts in Vietnam continue.
His proposals would soon be drafted and sent to Congress. Whether they were approved, modified, or rejected, the President made it clear that he would welcome their views.
I should like to say to the members of the opposition, whose numbers, if I am not mistaken, seem to have increased somewhat, that the genius of the American political system has always been best expressed through creative debate that offers choices and reasonable alternatives. Throughout our history, great Republicans and Democrats have seemed to understand this. So let there be light and reason in our relations. That is the way to a responsible session and a responsive government. Let us be remembered as a president and a Congress who tried to improve the quality of life for every American, not just the rich, not just the poor, but every man, woman, and child in this great nation of ours. We all go to school, to good schools or bad schools. We all take air into our lungs, clean air or polluted air. We all drink water, pure water or polluted water. We all face sickness someday, and some more often than we wish, and old age as well. We all have a stake in this great society, in its economic growth, in reduction of civil strife, a great stake in good government. And we just must not arrest the pace of progress that we've established in this country in these years.
The fifth objective was peace, not just in Vietnam, but around the world.
We're in the midst of a great transition, a transition from narrow nationalism to international partnership, from the harsh spirit of the Cold War to the hopeful spirit of common humanity on a troubled and a threatened planet.
The candor of the President's address was never more evident than in his closing remarks summarizing the war in Vietnam.
I wish I could report to you that the conflict is almost over. This I cannot do. We face more cost, more loss, and more agony. For the end is not yet. I cannot promise you that it will come this year or come next year. Our adversary still believes, I think tonight, that he can go on fighting longer than we can, and longer than we and our allies will be prepared to stand up and resist. But we have lived with danger for a long time before, and we shall live with it for a long time yet to come. We know that man is born unto trouble. We also know that this nation was not forged and did not survive and grow and prosper without a great deal of sacrifice from a great many men.
With the annual address to Congress behind him, the chief executive's work was only beginning. He would, in the ensuing weeks, send a series of messages and letters to the Hill, outlining in detail the dozen or more special proposals he had sketched only briefly in the State of the Union address. Momentary public appearances to receive credentials, to preside over ceremonies, only served to conceal the exhaustive, often unglamorous work that kept the federal machinery running. The President initiated new reorganization plans, and at the same time saw the fruition of plans he had started earlier.
Alan Boyd will undertake a major assignment in attempting to coordinate a national transportation policy for this great land of ours. He will bring together, as authorized and approved by the Congress, more than 30 various agencies and attempt to get economy and efficiency and give the kind of results that the American people would like to point to with pride.
On the 17th of January at the White House, the President and Mrs. Johnson honored 3 statesmen representing each of the 3 branches of government.
Each of these men has passed through many trials. Each has borne the burden of many conflicts. And each has suffered the venomous abuse that often attends good men in public life. Yet never have they retreated. Never have they for one moment withdrawn from the struggle. These 3 men have loved the law, and they have loved the human spirit. They have strengthened the institutions of government, and they have understood the demands of change.
Following a dinner in their honor, the distinguished guests were invited by the President and Mrs. Johnson to the White House Theater. The entertainment would have special significance, for it was the birthday of the star attraction, a presidential favorite. The air war in Vietnam has been called the most difficult in history. It is self-limited, requiring the maximum amount of pressure with a minimum amount of danger to both friendly forces in the south and civilian population centers in the north. Major Bernard F. Fisher of the Air Force is one exponent of that war. The first air officer to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for service in Vietnam, Major Fisher was decorated in a White House ceremony on the 19th of January. The Major's wife and 5 future airmen, including the very impressionable Scott Fisher, were flown in from Hahn Air Base, Germany, for the occasion. The President remarked that men like Major Fisher were doing more than helping to defeat a treacherous enemy.
They are helping a young nation to be free and to be born and to be independent. They are helping their own nation, the United States of America, to honor a pledge and to keep a commitment and to make its word good and to be treated and trusted and respected in its alliances.
The young nation the President referred to appointed a new ambassador to the United States. On the 23rd of January, the chief executive received his credentials.
The peoples of Asia now know that the door to independence is not going to be slammed shut. They know that it is possible for them to choose their own national destinies without coercion. The performance of our men in Vietnam, backed by the American people, has created a feeling of confidence and unity among the independent nations of Asia and the Pacific.
On the 26th of January, the President saw renewed evidence that a common outlook and common institutions were growing in the Western Hemisphere as well as in the East. President-elect Costa e Silva of Brazil, on a world tour prior to his March 15th inauguration, was guest of honor at the White House.
It is a good day for us when one of our fellow Americans comes to visit us in this house. It inspires us to feel again how very much we have in common in this hemisphere, how interdependent we really are, and how very closely our destinies are woven together.
They discussed the United States aid program to Brazil. Through this program, Brazil not only helps her own people, but sees the strengthening of overall hemispheric stability. Aid to Brazil was only one small part of the nation's awesome financial responsibility, a responsibility outlined in detail in the annual budget President Johnson had just released to Congress. In the upcoming fiscal year, the federal government would spend over $172 billion. If the figure was unprecedented, it was largely due to a new system of federal bookkeeping. The old administrative budget had given way to the National Income Accounts budget. With this new yardstick, the President and his economic advisors will be able to steer a more effective course between inflation and recession. As he released the economic report to Congress, the President noted that both these fiscal dangers are never distant in a high-level economy. Also never distant, as long as the Johnsons occupy the White House, is the memory of an earlier Democratic president. As the month of January was drawing to a close, President and Mrs. Johnson unveiled a portrait of one of the great figures that had influenced Lyndon Johnson during his own political growth. The portrait was painted especially for the White House art collection by Elizabeth Shumatoff. Madam Shumatoff had been working on an earlier portrait of President Roosevelt at Warm Springs, Georgia, at the time of his death in 1945.
This painting will, as long as I am president, hang in my office where I can see it and where I need it. I hope that all who view it there will see in it eternal evidence that times of trial can bring out the best in men and can bring out the best in nations.
Selected readings from Sunrise at Campobello highlighted the White House reception. Doree Shary and Ann Seymour, Mary Fickett and Charlton Heston helped bring to life the early years of Roosevelt and his personal triumph over pain and tragedy. It was January 27th. A diplomatic achievement, ordinarily destined for the headlines, would, in 1 hour's time, be pushed back to page 2. Representatives of 60 nations arrived at the White House to sign a treaty barring military weapons from outer space. The treaty, proposed by President Johnson less than a year ago and drafted at the United Nations, was hailed as a true landmark in man's march towards international peace and security. At the same time, the major signatories applauded the leadership of both the United States and Russia. A similar ceremony was being held in Moscow. Premier Kosygin toasted the document with champagne. Foreign Minister Gromyko signed it. And in the East Room of the White House, Ambassador Dobrynin expressed his hope that other urgent problems could also be solved before long. Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Ambassador to the United Nations Arthur Goldberg signed for the United States. Someday, President Johnson remarked, cosmonauts and astronauts will meet on the surface of the moon, not as warriors, but as brothers. In the composing room of every major morning paper, banner headlines had already been prepared, heralding the historic peace pact. Within 30 minutes, however, those headlines would be scrubbed. On pad 34 at Cape Kennedy, a routine spaceflight simulation would turn to sudden tragedy. A flash fire gutting the space capsule would claim the lives of Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Gus Grissom, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Edward White, and Navy Commander Roger Chaffee.
We have lived with danger for a long time before, and we shall live with it for a long time yet to come. We know that man is born unto trouble. We also know that this nation was not forged and did not survive and grow and prosper without a great deal of sacrifice from a great many men.